It started as an ordinary backyard party. Open doors, soft music, warm air, kids running between shadows and porch lights like it was any other summer night. No one kept count because no one thought they had to. Parents talked. Cups sweated on folding tables. Laughter rose and fell, and the neighborhood felt like one shared living room. Then a name was called into the dark, and nothing answered back. Another name. Still nothing. The music kept playing for a moment, as if sound alone could hold everything together. But the yard was getting quieter, and the silence was starting to feel organized. Asterisk, asterisk. The night began the way ordinary nights always do, without warning, without significance, without any sense that it would one day be remembered with a weight too heavy for memory to carry comfortably. It was the kind of evening people later struggle to describe, because nothing about it felt remarkable at the time. Warm air clung gently to skin. The sky was clear, stretched wide and indifferent above a quiet suburban neighborhood that had learned to trust its own routines. It was the early 1990s, a time before constant alerts and digital footprints, when summer nights still felt like open invitations rather than risks to be managed. The house sat at the center of the block, lights glowing softly from every window, doors left open because there was nothing to fear. Music drifted outward, not loud enough to demand attention, just enough to signal that something pleasant was happening inside. Laughter spilled into the yard in uneven bursts. Folding tables sagged slightly under bowls of chips, half-melted ice, plastic cups sweating onto borrowed tablecloths. Parents gathered in loose clusters, leaning against fences or porch railings, conversations looping lazily from work to weather to school schedules. It was a party in the most unremarkable sense of the word. No occasion worth remembering, no milestone worth marking. Just neighbors, just families, just children being children. The kids moved differently than the adults. They never stayed in one place for long. They darted between rooms, slipped out the back door, circled the yard, vanished into pockets of shadow, and reappeared somewhere else moments later. Their energy felt endless, their voices overlapping in high, careless bursts. Some played games with rules that shifted every few minutes. Others sat on the grass, whispering secrets that would feel embarrassingly small in the morning. A few lingered near the adults, tugging sleeves for attention before being gently dismissed back into freedom of a night. Each child carried their own small universe into that evening. One had scraped knees and a habit of asking too many questions. Another was quieter, content to observe rather than lead. There was a child who laughed too loudly, one who clung to a sibling's side, one who had begged all week to be allowed to stay out late. These were not statistics or silhouettes. They were faces flushed with heat, hands sticky from spilled soda, sneakers worn thin at the toes. They were trusted to the night because the night had never betrayed anyone before. The adults barely noticed when the children drifted farther away from the house. It felt natural, safe. The neighborhood itself had always functioned like an extension of the living room. Backyards blended into one another. Sidewalks were familiar paths worn smooth by years of bike tires and chalk drawings. Everyone knew everyone, or at least believed they did. Trust wasn't something that had to be negotiated. It simply existed, like gravity. As dusk deepened, porch lights flicked on one by one, casting soft halos on the lawns that had seen countless evenings just like this. The music shifted tracks. Someone refilled the drinks. A joke landed particularly well, and a wave of laughter rolled across the group of adults like a gentle tide. Time moved forward without drawing attention to itself. No one checked a watch. No one felt the need to take stock. At some point, one of the parents called out a name. It wasn't urgent, just a reflex, the way parents do when they haven't seen their child for a few minutes. The call was met with nothing more than the sound of crickets and distant laughter from somewhere down the block. The parents smiled, assuming the child was nearby, absorbed in a game or conversation too important to interrupt. It wasn't unusual. Children vanished and reappeared all the time. That was the rhythm of nights like these. Another name was called not long after. Then another. Still no alarm. Just casual glances exchanged between adults, mild curiosity rather than concern. Someone suggested the kids were probably in the basement. Someone else joked that they were plotting something mischievous. The idea that anything else could be happening didn't form, because there was no space for it to exist yet. Inside the house, the air was warm and heavy with the scent of food and bodies. The floors bore faint scuff marks from running feet earlier in the evening. Empty cups lined the counters like evidence of enjoyment. In one room, a television murmured to no one in particular. In another, coats were piled carelessly, forgotten until the night's end. The house felt lived and alive, utterly unthreatened. Outside, the yard stretched quietly toward the edges of the neighborhood. Trees rustled softly. Shadows gathered in places where light couldn't quite reach. The children's voices, once constant, had thinned without anyone noticing. Not vanished completely, just softened, scattered. It was subtle enough to be missed, like the moment music stops and conversation fills a gap before anyone realizes something is different. When the next name was called, there was a slight pause afterward, a fraction of a second longer than before. A parent scanned the yard more carefully this time, eyes adjusting to the darkness. Still no response. A small crease formed between brows, quickly smoothed away. The assumption remained that this was nothing. It had to be nothing. Nights like this didn't turn into stories people told decades later. They ended with sleepy goodbyes and promises to do it again soon. No one noticed the exact moment when the evening shifted from ordinary to irreversible. There was no sound to mark it, no visible line separating before from after, just a gradual, imperceptible drift away from safety, like a boat untethering itself while everyone on board is distracted by the view. By the time someone suggested counting the children, the night had already taken something it would never return. The house still glowed warmly. The music still played. The adults still stood where they had been standing minutes earlier, unaware that they were balanced on the edge of a memory that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The night did not look different. It did not feel different, and that was what made it so dangerous. Because when something terrible finally revealed itself, it did so not with a scream, but with silence. At first, the absence felt like a misunderstanding rather than a warning. One of those small, easily corrected moments that happen at every gathering, where children move freely and adults assume order exists even when they are not watching closely. A parent stepped into the yard, cupped their hands around their mouth, and called out again, louder this time, with a note of expectation rather than fear. The name carried across the grass and dissolved into the night without echo or reply. Someone laughed it off, suggesting the kids had probably wandered to the end of the block. Another parent nodded, already halfway convinced, because belief was easier than imagining alternatives. The music continued to play from inside the house, its cheerful rhythm strangely out of place against the growing stillness outside. Cups were refilled. Conversations resumed, but not quite as smoothly as before. Words overlapped. Sentences trailed off. Attention drifted, fractured by the subtle realization that something was slightly off. Another name was called, then two more. The tone had changed now, less casual, more pointed. Parents began to scan faces, instinctively counting, without realizing they were doing it. One mother walked toward the side yard, peering behind a row of hedges. A father stepped onto the sidewalk, shading his eyes as if the darkness itself were hiding something just beyond his reach. Still no panic, just a tightening in the chest that no one wanted to acknowledge yet. The idea that children could disappear from a place this familiar felt absurd. This wasn't a park in the middle of nowhere or a crowded public event filled with strangers. This was home. This was the neighborhood where doors were left unlocked and bicycles lay abandoned on lawns overnight. The assumption of safety had been built slowly over years, reinforced by repetition. Nothing bad had ever happened here. That history felt like proof. But then someone said out loud, almost as a joke, almost as a test, how many kids were here again? The question hung in the air longer than it should have. Parents exchanged glances, each one mentally tracing the evening backward, trying to remember faces and movements, try to reconstruct a timeline that had never seemed important enough to record. They began calling out together now, names overlapping, voices layered with forced brightness. The sound traveled farther, carried by the still night air, reaching houses up and down the block. Porch lights flicked on as neighbors stepped outside, curious, sensing a disturbance without understanding its shape yet. The neighborhood felt suddenly exposed, as if the darkness had thickened while no one was paying attention. Someone checked inside the house, moving room to room with increasing urgency. The basement was empty. The bathroom lights were off. The corners where children had been laughing earlier now held only silence and discarded cups. Shoes lay by the door untouched. Jackets hung where they had been left, waiting for bodies that did not return to fill them. The realization crept in slowly, painfully, like cold water seeping through fabric. The music was turned down, then off entirely. Without it, the night felt louder in an unsettling way. Every insect, every distant car, every breath suddenly noticeable. Parents spread out instinctively, forming search patterns without planning them. They looked behind sheds, inside garages, along fences. Names were called again and again, each repetition sharpening the fear that had been trying to surface since the first unanswered call. The count came next. Someone suggested it with a trembling voice, and no one argued. They gathered, faces pale in the porch light, and started listing names. 1, 2, 3. Each name was answered by a parent stepping forward, relief flickering briefly before being replaced by dread as the list continued. When they reached the end, the number was impossible to ignore. 12. 12 children unaccounted for. Not one, not two, a number so large it broke through denial all at once, collapsing it under its own weight. The shift from concern to panic was immediate and absolute. Voices rose, no longer controlled. Some parents ran, calling names with desperation that cracked their voices. Others stood frozen, hands over mouths, eyes wide, as if movement itself might make the situation more real. Phones appeared in shaking hands. Calls were made to neighbors, to relatives, to anyone who might have seen something. The same questions were asked again and again. When did you last see them? Which direction were they going? Were they together? No answers came back, only confusion and growing fear. The children hadn't left a trail. They hadn't left anything at all. Time began to behave strangely. Minutes stretched and folded in on themselves, impossible to measure. Every passing second felt heavier than the last, pressing down on chests, making it hard to breathe. Parents moved faster now, scanning farther, crossing streets they had never worried about before. The safety of the neighborhood evaporated, replaced by the realization that familiarity had bred blindness. Someone suggested checking the nearby park. A group rushed off, flashlights bobbing like frantic fireflies in the dark. Others knocked on doors, voices urgent, explaining too quickly, barely able to articulate what was wrong. Some neighbors joined the search without asking questions. The seriousness in the parents' faces said enough. But everywhere they looked, the answer was the same. Empty swings, silent sidewalks, dark yards. The children were not hiding. They were not playing a game. They were not lost in the way children sometimes are, circling back eventually with sheepish smiles. They were simply gone. Fear settled into something deeper now, something cold and disorienting. Parents began to realize that whatever had happened, it had happened quietly. No screams had been heard, no struggle noticed. The idea that something could remove 12 children without leaving a sound felt impossible, and yet there was no other explanation left standing. When the police were finally called, it felt like crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. The words sounded unreal as they were spoken into the phone. Missing children. Multiple, all from the same place. The operator's voice changed immediately, professional calm tightening around urgency. Instructions were given. Stay put. Keep searching. Officers were on the way. As flashing lights approached in the distance, the party ceased to exist entirely. What remained was a collection of adults standing in the aftermath of a normal evening that had transformed into a nightmare without warning. The house that felt warm and welcoming now looked hollow, its open doors an accusation rather than an invitation. The music never resumed. It would never sound the same again. By the time the first patrol car pulled up, no one was pretending anymore. The truth had settled in, heavy and undeniable. The children were not just missing from the party. They were missing from the night itself. The arrival of the police did not bring relief. It brought confirmation that what had begun as confusion had now crossed into something far more serious. Red and blue lights spilled across the street, washing over houses and faces in sharp, unnatural colors. The neighborhood, once soft and familiar, suddenly looked like a place caught under interrogation. Doors opened wider as officers stepped out, their movements controlled, their expressions already shifting from routine to concern as the scope of the situation became clear. Parents spoke all at once, voices colliding in a desperate attempt to be heard. Names were repeated, ages recited, clothing described down to the smallest detail, as if precision might summon the children back through sheer accuracy. Officers raised their hands gently, asking for order, tried to create structure where emotion had taken over. Notebooks appeared. Radios crackled. Questions came quickly now, layered and methodical, cutting through the panic with practiced efficiency. The street was blocked off almost immediately. Yellow tape appeared where children had been racing back and forth just hours earlier. Cars were redirected. Curious neighbors were asked to stay back. The transformation was jarring. This was no longer a neighborhood gathering. It was a crime scene, though no one wanted to use that word yet. The absence of visible damage made the designation feel unreal, as if the scene itself was lying. Search units were called in. Officers moved through yards with flashlights, beams sweeping across grass and hedges, illuminating nothing but dew and startled insects. Dogs arrived, trained and focused, their handlers guiding them carefully through the same paths the children might have taken. Parents watched every movement, clinging to each small action as proof that progress was being made, that answers were close, that this nightmare had edges that could be reached. But the dogs circled back again and again, confused. Scents were weak, scattered, as if the children had dissolved into the air rather than walked away. Handlers exchanged quiet words, their expressions tightening. This was not what a simple wandering case looked like. The ground offered nothing. No dropped toys. No footprints clear enough to follow. No signs of a struggle. The night had swallowed the evidence whole. As hours passed, the temperature dropped, but no one noticed. Jackets were forgotten. Parents stood rooted in place, refusing to leave the street, afraid that stepping away might mean missing the moment their child returned. Some paced, wearing grooves into the pavement. Others sat on curbs, staring at nothing, faces hollowed by shock. Time lost its meaning. Midnight passed unnoticed. Then 1 a.m. Then later still, officers continued to ask questions, retracing the evening again and again. When did you last see them? Who was with them? Did anything unusual happen earlier? Each retelling felt like confession, even though no one had done anything wrong. Parents searched their memories for moments that now felt loaded with significance. A laugh that ended too abruptly, a child running off without saying where they were going, a stranger who might have been there or might not have existed at all. The house at the center of it all became a focal point. Officers moved through it carefully, documenting rooms that hours earlier had been filled with noise and movement. The kitchen counters were sticky with spilled soda. Balloons drooped, slowly deflating, as if exhausted by the night's transformation. In one room, a half-finished game lay abandoned, pieces frozen mid-play. It felt wrong to look at these things, as if they belonged to another timeline entirely. Outside, the search expanded beyond the immediate block. More units arrived. The perimeter grew wider. Streets that had never known urgency now echoed with radios and footsteps. Helicopters were discussed, then called in. Their distant thrum added a low, relentless vibration to the night, an audible reminder that the situation had escalated beyond anything the community had ever faced. Despite the increasing scale, nothing emerged. No sightings, no credible leads. Just the same empty spaces where children should have been. Officers began exchanging looks that parents recognized instinctively, even if they didn't want to name what those looks meant. The longer a search went on without results, the darker the implications became. As dawn approached, exhaustion settled over the scene like a fog. Faces were drawn. Voices were hoarse. Some parents had begun to shake, their bodies finally reacting to the shock they had been holding at bay. Volunteers brought blankets and coffee. Small gestures that felt almost insulting against the enormity of the situation. yet were accepted because there was nothing else to hold on to. The rising sun revealed details that the dark had hidden, but it did not reveal the children. Morning light made the neighborhood look painfully normal. Birds chirped. Lawns glistened with dew. The contrast was unbearable. It felt as though the world was mocking the devastation that had unfolded overnight, continuing on as if nothing had happened. With daylight came more officials, more coordination, more seriousness. The case was formally escalated. Missing children were now officially declared missing persons, a phrase that carried legal weight and emotional devastation in equal measure. Parents listened as procedures were explained, barely comprehending the words. Amber alerts were discussed. Media involvement was inevitable. The story would soon belong to the public. Reporters arrived before some parents had even processed the night's events. Cameras appeared, lenses hungry for images of grief. Microphones were extended toward shaking mouths. Some parents spoke, voices breaking as they begged for help, for information, for mercy. Others turned away, unable to bear the idea that their worst moment might become someone else's headline. Investigators worked tirelessly, but the lack of evidence gnawed at them. A case built on absence was a fragile thing. Every theory required assumptions. Every lead evaporated under scrutiny. The idea that 12 children could vanish from a single location without a trace defied logic, yet logic offered no alternative explanation. By the time the sun fully claimed the sky, the neighborhood was irrevocably changed. What had once been a place defined by familiarity and trust now felt exposed, violated. Parents stood together, bound by a shared horror that no one else could truly understand. They spoke in hushed tones, as if afraid that speaking too loudly might make the reality permanent. The party was never mentioned again, not as an event, not as a memory worth revisiting. It became something else entirely, a marker in time, a dividing line between before and after. The night had taken 12 children, but it had also taken something less tangible and just as important. The belief that safety was a given. As investigators packed up for morning, promising to return with reinforcements, one truth hung heavy in the air. The search had only just begun, but already the silence was louder than any scream. The days that followed did not arrive gently. They came with an exhausting weight, each one pressing down harder than the last, blurring together until time felt less like a sequence and more like a single, unending moment of waiting. Morning brought no relief. Night offered no rest. Sleep became something people pretended to do, lying still with eyes closed while their minds replayed the same questions over and over, searching for a detail that might unlock everything. At first, hope was stubborn. It refused to leave, even when logic tried to push it away. Parents told themselves the children had wandered farther than expected and would be found soon. Maybe they had gone to a nearby house and fallen asleep. Maybe they were together somewhere, safe, waiting to be noticed. These thoughts were repeated like prayers, clung to with a desperation that bordered on superstition. To give them up felt like surrendering to something irreversible. Search efforts intensified. Volunteers poured in from surrounding neighborhoods and towns, faces solemn, movements purposeful. They walked fields, checked wooded areas, combed drainage ditches, and abandoned lots. Flyers were printed in bulk, the children's faces smiling back from glossy paper, frozen in moment of joy that now felt painfully out of place. The flyers were taped to lampposts, store windows, bus stops. Every surface became a plea. The media arrived in full force. News vans lined the streets. Reporters spoke in measured tones, describing the situation with words like unprecedented and mysterious. The story spread quickly, carried by headlines that grew more dramatic with each retelling. 12 children, one party, no trace. The country leaned in, curious and horrified, hungry for answers that no one had. With attention came speculation. Rumors began circulating almost immediately, filling the vacuum left by the lack of information. Someone claimed to have seen a van parked near the block that night. Someone else swore they heard voices arguing somewhere in the dark. Online forums and call-in shows buzzed with theories, each one more elaborate than the last. Cult activity, organized trafficking, satanic rituals, stranger danger narratives shaped by fear rather than fact. Every rumor felt plausible to someone desperate enough to believe it. Law enforcement struggled to contain the chaos. Tips flooded in by the hundreds, then thousands. Most led nowhere. Some contradicted each other completely. Investigators followed each one carefully, knowing that even the smallest detail could matter, but the sheer volume threatened to overwhelm the case. The public wanted answers immediately. Investigators knew reality moved slower than that. Families lived suspended between hope and dread. Phones rang constantly. Each call triggered a surge of adrenaline, followed by crushing disappointment when the voice on the other end offered nothing concrete. Parents jumped at every sound outside their homes, every passing car, every knock on the door. Some refused to leave the house at all, afraid that absence might somehow delay their child's return. The neighborhood itself became a place of quiet tension. People spoke in hushed voices. Children who remained were kept indoors, watched closely, their parents suddenly aware of dangers they had never considered before. What once felt like a safe community now felt fragile, exposed. Trust had been shaken, and no one knew how to rebuild it. Investigators began holding press conferences, careful with their words. They emphasized that there was no evidence of a single suspect, no confirmation of any particular theory. They asked the public for patience, for facts rather than speculation. Their calm professionalism contrasted sharply with the emotional chaos unfolding behind the scenes. Each unanswered question added pressure, both internal and external. As days turned into a week, hope began to change shape. It grew quieter, more guarded. Parents stopped imagining dramatic reunions and started clinging to smaller possibilities. A sighting, a clue, proof that their children were still alive somewhere. The absence of evidence became its own kind of message, one that no one wanted to interpret too deeply. Some families began to fracture under the strain. Marriages were tested, tempers flared, guilt surfaced in unexpected ways. Parents replayed the night obsessively, scrutinizing their own decisions. Why didn't I check sooner? Why didn't I follow them? Why did I assume everything was fine? These questions had no answers, only echoes. The community tried to show support. Meals were dropped off. Vigils were held. Candles flickered in the evening air, tiny flames representing lives that felt impossibly distant. Strangers hugged parents they had never met before, offering words that felt insufficient the moment they were spoken. Everyone wanted to help, but no one knew how. Behind closed doors, investigators faced an unsettling reality. Despite the massive response, there was still no clear direction. The lack of physical evidence was troubling. No witnesses had come forward with definitive information. Surveillance cameras were rare in that era, and those that existed offered nothing useful. The case seemed to resist every attempt to impose order on it. As the second week approached, officials were forced to acknowledge what everyone feared. The investigation was stalling. Leads were drying up. The initial surge of attention could not be sustained forever. Other stories would replace this one. Resources would eventually be diverted. The unspoken truth hung heavy in every briefing room and living room alike. The word cold was not used publicly, but it hovered just beneath the surface. Parents sensed it in the careful language, in the way officials avoided making promises. They began to realize that time was no longer their ally. Each passing day without answers made the possibility of resolution feel more distant, more fragile. Still, the families refused to let the case fade quietly. They organized, advocated, demanded continued attention. They spoke to anyone who would listen, determined to keep their children's names alive. Hope, though wounded, was not entirely gone. It had simply become something harder, something quieter, something that existed alongside the growing fear that some truths, once buried, might never fully surface. The days after the disappearance did not bring clarity. They brought noise. They brought questions without answers, theories without proof, and a painful awareness that the world could move on even when their own lives could not. What had begun as a single night of confusion had now stretched into an open wound, one that time showed no intention of healing. As weeks passed, the intensity of the search began to thin, not because the urgency had disappeared, but because attention is a resource the world rations carefully. The initial flood of volunteers slowed to a trickle. Media trucks packed up one by one, moving on to fresher tragedies, fresher mysteries. Headlines that once dominated front pages were reduced to brief updates, then to silence. For the families, the quiet felt louder than the chaos ever had. Life, in a cruel imitation of normalcy, attempted to resume around them. Schools reopened. Traffic returned to its usual rhythm. Neighbors went back to work, back to routines that now felt hollow and inappropriate. The neighborhood still stood, unchanged in appearance, but everything about it felt different. Every sidewalk carried the echo of running feet that would never pass over it again. Every front yard felt like a reminder of something that had slipped away unnoticed. Inside the homes of the missing children, time froze. Bedrooms remained exactly as they had been left. Beds stayed unmade. Clothes lay folded where they had last been placed, as if the children might return at any moment and need them. Parents moved through these rooms carefully, reverently, touching objects not to use them but to remember how they once felt in smaller hands. Dust gathered slowly, and no one dared wipe it away. Investigators continued their work, though now it happened mostly out of sight. Files grew thicker. Timelines were rebuilt again and again, each version slightly different from the last as memories shifted and new interpretations emerged. Officers revisited early assumptions, questioning decisions that had once seemed sound. Was a lead dismissed too quickly? Was a witness overlooked because their story didn't fit? The absence of answers made every choice feel suspect in hindsight. There were moments of false hope. A reported sighting in another state sent shockwaves through the families. For a brief, agonizing stretch of time, parents allowed themselves to imagine recognition, rescue, reunion. Investigators followed the lead with cautious optimism, only for it to collapse under verification. The disappointment that followed felt worse than the initial fear, a reminder how dangerous hope could be when it rose too high. The case refused to settle into the past. Even as official attention waned, the mystery lingered in the collective consciousness of the town. People spoke about it in lowered voices, avoiding details but never quite letting it go. Newcomers were told the story eventually, usually with pause beforehand, as if deciding whether to pass the wait along. The night of the party became shorthand for loss, a reference point everyone understood without explanation. For the families, grief evolved into something less visible but more constant. It became a companion rather than an event. They learned how to function around it, how to smile when required, how to answer polite questions without breaking apart. But beneath the surface, everything was filtered through absence. Every holiday, every birthday, every ordinary milestone carried a shadow of what was missing. Some parents threw themselves into advocacy, determined to keep the case alive. They organized memorials that refused to call themselves memorials, because that word implied an ending they could not accept. They spoke at events, distributed flyers long after the ink had faded, kept the children's faces circulating even when recognition had turned into familiarity without urgency. Forgetting, they believed, was the greatest danger of all. Others withdrew, retreating into private grief. They stopped answering phones. They avoided places that reminded them too much of what they had lost. Their silence was often misunderstood, mistaken for resignation rather than self-preservation. Each family carried the weight differently, and no approach offered relief. Behind the scenes, investigators faced growing frustration. The case had become an anomaly, too large to ignore, too empty to solve. No clear suspects emerged. No physical evidence tied anyone to the disappearance. The lack of resolution gnawed at those assigned to it, particularly the ones who had been there from the beginning. They carried the faces of the children with them, reminders of unfinished work that followed them home at night. Occasionally, a new theory would surface within the task force, sparked by a re-examination of old data or detail newly understood. These theories were discussed quietly, cautiously, aware of how easily speculation could spiral into distraction. Without proof, ideas remained just that, ideas. The case demanded certainty, and certainty refused to appear. As months turned into a year, the word cold began to appear in internal conversations. It was not spoken lightly. Declaring a case cold did not mean giving up, but it did acknowledge a shift in reality. Resources were reassigned. Active searches gave way to periodic reviews. The investigation entered a kind of suspended animation, waiting for something external to reignite it. For the families, this transition felt like abandonment, even when officials insisted otherwise. They heard the change in tone, saw the difference in frequency, felt the slowing momentum. It was as if the world had decided that enough time had passed, that unanswered questions were an acceptable outcome. That acceptance was something they could not share. The children's names, once spoken daily by strangers, became personal again. They lived in family conversations, in quiet moments, in memories that grew sharper even as years passed. Parents aged in ways that had nothing to do with time. Their lives became divided into before and after, with no bridge between the two. Yet the case never truly disappeared. It lingered in files, in unresolved reports, in the minds of those who had touched it and couldn't let go. Every so often, an investigator would return to it, flipping through old notes, wondering if something had been missed. The mystery had a way of resurfacing unexpectedly, refusing to stay buried. What remained was a strange, unsettled stillness. The initial shock had faded, but the absence endured, unchanged by time. The children were not found. The truth was not uncovered. And in that void, the case became something more than an investigation. It became a reminder that not all stories resolve, that some questions linger not because they are unimportant, but because they are too difficult to answer. The silence that followed was not peace. It was simply the sound of a world moving forward while a handful of lives remained permanently paused, waiting for something, anything, to finally break through. Years passed in a way that felt uneven, as if time itself had learned to avoid the places most affected by what happened. The neighborhood changed gradually, almost cautiously. Families moved away. New ones arrived, unaware at first of the history embedded in the sidewalks and fences. Children grew up hearing fragments of the story, warnings disguised as folklore, a cautionary tale that adults referenced without ever fully explaining. The party became something spoken about indirectly, a shadow that lingered just outside ordinary conversation. For those who had lived through it, the memory never dulled. It hardened. It sharpened around the edges. Parents learned how to carry grief without displaying it, how to function in a world that had offered no answers and no resolution. Birthdays passed unacknowledged or marked in private. The missing children never aged in photographs. Their faces remained fixed in time while everyone else moved forward, a contrast that felt both comforting and unbearable. The case itself sat quietly in storage, boxed into files that grew yellow with age. Officially, it was inactive. Unofficially, it was unfinished. Investigators who had worked it early in their careers carried it with them as they moved on to other assignments, other cities, other crimes that at least came with conclusions. But every so often, something would pull them back. A headline, a rumor, a case that felt just a little too familiar. It began with similarities that were easy to dismiss. A missing child in another state. Then another, years later, somewhere else entirely. Each case on its own made sense within its own context. Runaway, custody dispute, accident. But when viewed through the lens of memory, they formed echoes that were difficult to ignore. Ages matched too closely. Circumstances felt uncomfortably aligned. Community events, moments of distraction, groups rather than individuals. At first, these connections lived only in the minds of those who remember the original case. They weren't formal theories, just uneasy thoughts that surfaced late at night or during quiet moments at work. Investigators are trained to recognize patterns, but they are also trained to distrust coincidences that feel too convenient. For years, these similarities remain just that, coincidences. Technology, however, does not share the same reluctance. As databases expanded and information became easier to cross-reference, old cases were digitized, tagged, made searchable in ways that hadn't been possible before. What once required memory and intuition could now be tested against data. Names, dates, locations, circumstances, all could be laid side by side without emotional attachment. It was during one of these routine digitization efforts that something shifted. A retired investigator, brought in as a consultant to help review unsolved cases, noticed a familiar configuration of details. Not identical, but close enough to raise questions. a child disappearing during a community gathering. Another case involving multiple children who vanished within a narrow time window. Different states, different years, same underlying structure. The realization did not arrive dramatically. It settled slowly, like a thought that refused to be dismissed once acknowledged. The investigator began pulling files, comparing notes, building informal timelines on scraps of paper. Alone at first, careful not to overstate what could still be coincidence. But the more cases were examined, the harder it became to ignore the pattern forming beneath the surface. What made it unsettling was not just the similarities, but the gaps. In each case, evidence was minimal. Witnesses were uncertain. The disappearances happened quickly, quietly, without chaos. It suggested planning rather than impulse, patience rather than opportunity. Whoever was responsible, if there was a single responsible force, understood how communities functioned, where attention went when vigilance lapsed. As these observations were shared with colleagues, reactions were mixed. Some dismissed the idea outright, pointing to the dangers of pattern seeking in unresolved cases. Others listened more carefully, recognizing the same unease they had felt but never articulated. Discussions remained cautious, contained within small circles. No one wanted to reopen old wounds without something solid to justify it, but the idea refused to stay contained. More cases were added to the comparison. More parallels emerged. The age ranges aligned too closely to ignore. The settings repeated themselves with uncomfortable consistency. The absence of immediate evidence became a shared trait rather than an anomaly. What once looked like isolated tragedies began to resemble fragments of something larger. For the families of the original 12, these developments remained unknown at first. They continued living with unanswered questions, unaware that their private nightmare might be part of a broader, darker pattern. The possibility that their children were not taken randomly, but deliberately, methodically, was both horrifying and validating in ways that were difficult to reconcile. Eventually, the information reached federal channels. Not as an accusation or a conclusion, but as a question. Could these cases be connected? Had something been missed because no one was looking wide enough? The passage of time, once seen as an obstacle, now became an asset. Distance allowed perspective. Technology allowed reach. When the possibility of a larger pattern was acknowledged at a higher level, it changed the tone of the conversation. What had been treated as a tragic anomaly was reclassified as a potential piece of a much broader investigation. The implications were staggering. If the disappearances were connected, it meant the truth had been hiding in plain sight for decades, fragmented across jurisdictions that never compared notes. For investigators, the realization was both energizing and sobering. It offered direction where there had been none, but also suggested a scale far beyond anything originally imagined. The idea that multiple children could be taken over years without detection challenged assumptions about safety, oversight, and the limits of awareness. When federal interest returned, it did not announce itself with urgency or spectacle. It arrived quietly, almost cautiously, as if aware of the weight it was disturbing. Files that had not been opened in years were requested, transferred, reviewed under new eyes that carried less emotional proximity but far broader reach. What had once been a local tragedy, then a dormant mystery, was now framed as a potential fragment of something national in scope. The FBI did not reopen the case because of a single revelation. There was no dramatic breakthrough, no sudden confession, no recovered evidence that forced their hand. What compelled them was accumulation, patterns layered over time, similarities that held up under scrutiny rather than dissolving. The kind of alignment that becomes impossible to ignore once it has been seen clearly. Agents approached the case with restraint. Decades had passed. Memories had faded. Evidence had aged or vanished entirely. They understood that rushing would only create noise. Instead, they began by reconstructing the past as faithfully as possible, not relying on emotion or reputation, but on structure. Timelines were rebuilt from scratch. Every known movement, every reported sighting, every unanswered question was placed into a wider framework that extended far beyond the original neighborhood. Technology became the silent partner in this process. Old reports were digitized and cross-referenced. Data sets that had once existed in isolation were now layered together, revealing intersections that had never been visible before. Events separated by hundreds of miles and years began to echo one another in subtle but unmistakable ways. The same age brackets, the same types of gatherings, the same narrow windows of opportunity. What unsettled the agents most was not what they found, but what they didn't. There was an absence of chaos in every case they reviewed. No witnesses describing frantic scenes. No evidence of panic. No sudden disruptions that might draw attention. Whatever had happened in each instance had unfolded smoothly, quietly, efficiently. That level of consistency suggested planning rather than chance. As the scope widened, so did the implications. If these disappearances were connected, it meant the responsible force, whether an individual or a network, had operated for years without detection, adapting to different locations, exploiting trust and routine. It meant that the very things communities relied on for safety had been used against them. Reaching out to the families again was handled with care. Agents understood that reopening old wounds could do harm as easily as it could offer hope. Conversations were slow, deliberate, respectful. Parents were informed that the case was being reviewed with new resources and a broader lens, not promised answers, not guaranteed outcomes. Just attention, just effort. The reactions varied. Some parents felt a cautious surge of relief, as if a door they had been knocking on for decades had finally opened, even if only a crack. Others responded with guarded skepticism, having learned the cost of believing too much. A few struggled with anger, questioning why it had taken so long, why this possibility had not been considered sooner. All reactions were valid. None were simple. Agents listened more than they spoke. They asked families to revisit memories they had long tried to keep contained. What seemed insignificant at the time. Who had been present? Were there faces they remembered, but never questioned? These conversations were emotionally taxing, often requiring breaks, sometimes ending in silence rather than answers. Memory, agents knew, was fragile and easily distorted by time and trauma. Behind closed doors, analysts began mapping connections that extended beyond geography. They studied behavioral patterns, not just of the missing children, but of the environments from which they vanished, community dynamics, event structures, levels of supervision. The goal was not to accuse, but to understand how vulnerability had been created and exploited. What emerged was a disturbing clarity. These were not crimes of opportunity in the traditional sense. They were opportunistic in a more calculated way. Whoever was responsible understood how to blend into the background, how to wait, how to recognize moments when attention fractured just enough to act. They understood human behavior intimately, especially the comfort people feel in familiar settings. The original party in 1993 was re-examined with this perspective, not as a chaotic lapse, but as a moment of collective trust. Adults distracted by routine, children moving freely, boundaries assumed rather than enforced. In that context, the disappearance no longer seemed impossible. It seemed tragically predictable. As federal resources were committed, the investigation gained momentum that had once been unimaginable. Jurisdictions that had never spoken began sharing information. Cases long dismissed as unrelated were reconsidered. Patterns were tested, refined, challenged. Some connections fell apart under scrutiny. Others held, growing stronger with each comparison. The deeper the investigation went, the more uncomfortable the silence became. What had once felt like absence now felt deliberate, engineered, as if the lack of evidence itself was part of the design. Federal analysts began to realize they were not chasing a single moment or a single mistake, but a structure, something that existed quietly alongside everyday life, rarely visible unless viewed from the right angle. It did not reveal itself all at once. There was no document labeled with name, no central figure stepping forward, no clear boundary marking where normalcy ended and something darker began. Instead, fragments emerged. Financial irregularities that had once seemed unrelated. Organizations that appeared benign on the surface, but dissolved under scrutiny. Individuals who moved frequently, leaving behind little more than traces that only made sense when stacked against one another. The pattern suggested coordination, but not in the way people expected. This was not chaos or brute force. It was patience. It was timing. It was understanding that the most effective way to remain invisible was to never disrupt the surface of things. The disappearances were not loud. They were not dramatic. They happened in spaces where trust had already been established, where suspicion felt out of place. Community events appeared again and again in the data. Parties, fairs, fundraisers, gatherings meant to bring people together. These were environments where adults relaxed their vigilance, where children moved freely, where strangers could blend in without raising concern. No single event stood out on its own. It was a repetition that made them significant. The idea that such spaces could be exploited so consistently was difficult to accept. It challenged deeply held beliefs about safety and intent. Analysts were careful with their language, aware of how easily fear could spiral. But internally, the conclusion was becoming harder to avoid. These disappearances were not random intersections of bad luck. They were facilitated by a system that understood how people behaved when they felt secure. As connections formed, the investigation shifted from asking who to asking how. How could children vanish without witnesses? How could no one hear anything? How could there be no physical struggle? The answers, unsettling as they were, pointed toward manipulation rather than force, compliance rather than resistance, familiarity rather than fear. Agents studied behavioral psychology alongside case files. They examined how authorities perceived, how trust is transferred, how easily routines override caution. They considered the possibility that the children had not been taken violently, but guided, that they may have believed they were following instructions, going somewhere safe, doing something harmless. The thought was devastating in its implications. The original party in 1993 took on new meaning under this lens. It was not just a moment of distraction. It was an environment rich with opportunity. Adults assumed that someone else was watching. Children assumed that any adult present was safe. Responsibility was diffuse, spread thin enough that it effectively vanished. The investigation uncovered evidence of coordination across state lines, though rarely direct. No single paper trail connected everything. Instead, there were overlapping timelines, shared methods, repeated logistical patterns, transportation routes that appeared in multiple cases, temporary locations used briefly, then abandoned, the kind of operational discipline that suggested experience. It became clear that whatever this was, it was not built overnight. It had likely evolved, refined over time, learning from close calls and mistakes. That evolution explained why earlier cases had been easier to dismiss as isolated incidents. The structure adapted, becoming quieter, more efficient, harder to detect. The emotional impact of this realization weighed heavily on everyone involved. Investigators understood that uncovering the truth would not restore what had been lost. It would not bring children back or erase decades of uncertainty. But it mattered nonetheless. Naming something gives it shape. Understanding it limits its power. For the families, when they were informed that the investigation had uncovered evidence of a broader, organized operation, the reaction was complex and deeply personal. Some felt a grim validation. The idea that their children's disappearance was not a meaningless accident offered a strange sense of order. Others recoiled from the implications, overwhelmed by the thought that what happened was intentional, planned, repeatable. Questions poured in. Why them? Why here? Why that night? Investigators could offer few answers. Patterns explain structure, not motive. They reveal how, not why. And sometimes the why is the most painful part to confront. The term network was used carefully, never publicly at first. It implied coordination without necessarily implying a single controlling entity. It allowed for the possibility of multiple actors operating within shared frameworks, bound by method rather than hierarchy. As the investigation widened and abstractions like patterns and networks began to dominate internal conversations, there was a growing awareness that something essential risked being lost. Data could explain structure. Timelines could show repetition. But none of it captured what had actually been taken. Before conclusions could be drawn, before responsibility could be assigned, the children themselves had to be brought back into focus, not as components of a case, but as lives interrupted. Investigators returned to the beginning, this time with a different intention. They reviewed school records, home videos, handwritten notes saved by parents who could not bring themselves to throw anything away. They watched birthday footage where candles flickered and children leaned forward with the unshakable confidence that wishes mattered. They listened to answering machine messages left in voices that had never aged beyond childhood. These were not procedural steps. They were acts of acknowledgement. Each child emerged as a presence rather than a statistic. One loved drawing, filling notebooks with careful sketches of animals and imaginary places. Another struggled in school but excelled at building things. Hands always busy, mind always searching for something tangible to fix or improve. There was a child who sang constantly, unaware of how off-key they were, and another who rarely spoke unless spoken to, but listened with a depth that surprised teachers. These details mattered. They resisted erasure. Parents were invited to share what they wanted remembered, not timelines or last sightings, but personalities, habits, the small, ordinary things that disappear from public narratives first. A nervous laugh, a stubborn streak, the way someone always ate dessert first. These memories were often shared hesitantly, as if exposing them might invite pain too sharp to manage. But once spoken, they filled the room with something human that had been absent for too long. The process was emotionally taxing. Parents cried not just for what had been lost, but for how long their children had been reduced to photos on flyers and names in reports. Being asked about favorite colors and bedtime routines decades later reopened wounds that had never fully closed. Yet, many welcomed the opportunity. It felt like reclaiming something that had been slowly stripped away by time and bureaucracy. Investigators documented these details carefully, not because they believed they would lead directly to answers, but because they restored balance. The case was no longer just about disappearance. It was about presence, about honoring the reality that each child had lived a full life, however brief, before it was taken. As these profiles were assembled, the emotional weight of the case shifted. Analysts who had previously engaged with the material intellectually now found themselves affected in ways they had not anticipated. It is one thing to study patterns. It is another look into the face of a child and understand that every unanswered question represents a future that never unfolded. This reframing also altered how evidence was interpreted. Details that once seemed trivial gained significance when viewed through the lens of individuality. A child's tendency to trust adults, another's eagerness to help, a third's desire to prove independence. These traits, innocent in isolation, could become vulnerabilities in the wrong context. Understanding who the children were helped explain how they might have been approached, guided, persuaded. For the families, this phase brought a bittersweet clarity. Seeing their children recognized in full, not just as missing, but as known, offered a sense of dignity that had been missing for years. At the same time, it made the finality harder to ignore. To speak in detail about someone is to acknowledge their absence more fully. The pain sharpened even as it found meaning. Some parents struggle with guilt that resurfaced unexpectedly. They questioned whether their child's personality had made them more vulnerable. Investigators were careful to counter this, emphasizing that responsibility lay solely with those who exploited trust, not with the children who offered it freely. Still, guilt is rarely rational. It attaches itself to anything it can reach. The children's stories also revealed the scale of what had been disrupted. These were not lives on the margins. They were deeply embedded in families, schools, friendships. Their absence created ripples that extended far beyond the immediate circle of grief. Teachers remembered empty desks that were never reassigned. Friends recalled growing up with an unexplained gap, a question mark that followed them into adulthood. As these narratives were compiled, they became part of the investigative record, not as evidence in the traditional sense, but as context. They grounded the case in humanity, ensuring that decisions were made with an awareness of their impact beyond legal outcomes. It was a quiet but profound shift. There was also a recognition that answers, even if found, would not undo what happened. No revelation could return childhoods or restore time. For some families, this realization brought a strange calm. The search for truth was no longer about rescue or reunion. It was about acknowledgement, about ensuring that what happened was seen clearly and named honestly. In some cases, Families express a desire for their children's names to be spoken publicly again, not in connection with fear or mystery, but as remembrance. They wanted the world to know who these children had been, not just what had happened to them. Investigators worked with care to respect these wishes, balancing transparency with sensitivity. The weight of decades pressed heavily during this phase. Parents had aged. Some were no longer alive to see the renewed attention. Their absence added another layer of loss, another reminder of time's irreversible passage. Siblings, now adults themselves, stepped into roles their parents could no longer fill, carrying memories forward on their behalf. As the children were reintroduced into the narrative, the case itself transformed. As the investigation edged closer to something resembling understanding, attention began to turn outward, away from individual actions and toward the systems that had allowed those actions to pass unnoticed. This shift was uncomfortable, even unsettling, because it suggested that responsibility did not rest in a single place. It was scattered, diffused across institutions, assumptions, and habits that had felt reasonable at the time but proved dangerously insufficient in hindsight. In the early 1990s, the world operated on a different rhythm. Information moved slowly. Jurisdictions were rigid, protective of their own boundaries. Databases did not speak to one another easily. If at all, a disappearance in one town lived and died within that town's records unless someone made an extraordinary effort to connect it elsewhere. This fragmentation was not malicious. It was structural, and it created gaps wide enough for entire stories to fall through. Law enforcement agencies did what they knew how to do, guided by the standards and knowledge of the era. They searched locally. They questioned immediate witnesses. They looked for visible signs of violence or disruption. When none appeared, theories softened, urgency diluted by uncertainty. The absence of evidence was often interpreted as the absence of crime, rather than as a different kind of signal altogether. Cultural context played a role as well. The early 90s were marked by a mixture of rising fear and misplaced focus. Public anxiety latched onto familiar villains, dramatic narratives that fit preconceived ideas of danger. Stories that did not align with those narratives struggled to gain traction. A case built on silence, on subtlety, on the exploitation of trust rather than force, did not fit cleanly into the dominant framework of fear. Communities, too, carried assumptions that shaped outcomes. The belief that danger came from outside rather than within, that familiar faces were inherently safer than unknown ones, that shared spaces equaled shared responsibility. These beliefs were not foolish. They were human, but they created blind spots, moments where vigilance was relaxed precisely because it felt unnecessary. No single person failed the children. That truth was perhaps the hardest to confront. Instead, many small, reasonable decisions aligned in a way that produced catastrophic results. Someone assumed someone else was watching. A report was filed but not escalated. A similarity between cases was noticed but dismissed as coincidence. Each action made sense in isolation. Together, they formed a system that did not know how to recognize what it was seeing. As federal investigators reviewed the history, they identified moments where different choices might have altered the trajectory. Earlier data sharing, broader pattern analysis, a willingness to question assumptions about how crimes are supposed to look. These observations were not accusations. They were acknowledgments. Understanding failure does not require assigning blame, but it does require honesty. The passage of time compounded these issues. As years passed without resolution, cases lost visibility. Detectives retired. Institutional memory faded. Files were archived, sometimes literally boxed away. Without new information, there was little incentive to revisit old questions, especially when resources were limited and new cases demanded attention. The unresolved became normalized. The investigation forced a reckoning with this normalization. It asked difficult questions about how many other cases had been quietly set aside because they did not behave the way investigators expected them to. How many warning signs had been interpreted as noise? How many families have been left carrying uncertainty alone because the system lacked the tools or perspective to see the full picture? This reckoning extended beyond law enforcement. Media cycles were examined, too. The way stories are framed, the way attention is allocated. Sensational cases with clear villains and dramatic visuals draw focus, while quieter tragedies struggle to hold it. The disappearance of 12 children should have defied this trend. Yet even that scale eventually succumbed to the world's appetite for novelty. There was also the uncomfortable truth that prevention had been discussed far more often than protection. Warnings were issued, advice was given. Responsibility was subtly shifted toward parents and communities rather than examined at a systemic level. The idea that awareness alone could prevent harm placed an unfair burden on individuals, while leaving larger vulnerabilities intact. As these insights emerged, they were documented carefully, not to dwell on regret, but to inform change. The goal was not to rewrite the past, but to learn from it, to recognize that safety is not a static condition, but an active process that requires adaptation as threats evolve. To accept that trust, while essential to community, must be paired with awareness rather than assumption. For the families, this part of the investigation was particularly painful. Hearing about missed opportunities and structural limitations reopened old wounds in a new way. In the end, there was no moment that felt like an ending, no clear line where the story resolved itself and allowed everyone involved to step back into something resembling peace. What remained was quieter than closure, heavier than answers. It was the understanding that some events do not conclude, they echo. The neighborhood still exists. Streets have been repaved, houses repainted. New families have moved in, carrying groceries through front doors that once stood open on a summer night long ago. Children still play outside, their laughter drifting through the same air, bouncing off the same fences. On the surface, life appears uninterrupted, as if time smoothed over what happened. But memory does not fade as easily as paint. For those who remember, the absence is woven into the landscape. Certain corners of the street feel heavier than others. Certain hours of the evening still bring a tightening in the chest. The night never fully regained its innocence. Even decades later, there is a quiet vigilance that lingers, a habit of watching a little longer, listening a little more closely. What was lost cannot be recovered, but what was learned refuses to disappear. The families live with a form of grief that has no ceremony. There are no graves to visit, no dates that offer resolution. Time did not bring healing so much as adaptation. They learned how to carry questions without answers, how to coexist with uncertainty. Some found meaning in advocacy. Others found it in silence. All found that life continued, even when they did not feel ready for it to do so. Photographs remain. Smiling faces captured in moments that were never meant to be final. These images do not age, even as the world around them does. Parents grow older. Siblings become adults. Entire lifetimes unfold in the space where those children should have been growing too. The contrast is relentless. It reminds everyone that time is not just something that passes. It is something that leaves people behind. The investigation, though it reached further than it ever had before, did not deliver the kind of certainty people imagine when they think of justice. There were revelations. There was clarity. There was a name given to what had once felt shapeless and impossible to define. But understanding did not erase loss. It simply framed it more clearly. Some truths, once uncovered, offer relief. Others offer only weight. Knowing that the disappearance was part of something larger did not make it easier to accept. It made it harder to ignore. It demanded acknowledgement, not just of what happened, but of what it meant. That the world is not always loud when it is dangerous. That harm does not always announce itself. That trust, while essential, can be exploited in ways that leave no immediate trace. There is a temptation to search for reassurance at the end of stories like this. To believe that awareness guarantees prevention, that exposure ensures safety. The reality is more fragile. Awareness is not a shield. It is a responsibility. It requires attention, humility, and the willingness to sit with discomfort rather than look away from it. What remains, more than anything, is vigilance shaped by memory, not paranoia, but presence. The understanding that safety is not a permanent condition, but something maintained through care, communication, and shared responsibility. The tragedy did not just take children from one night in 1993. It reshaped how many people understand the world they live in. For those who were children themselves at the time, now grown, the story became a quiet undercurrent in their lives. It influenced how they parent, how they trust, how they move through public spaces. Even those who left the neighborhood carried it with them, an invisible marker in their understanding of loss and risk. The event did not end. It transformed. The FBI eventually stepped back, as investigations must. Files were updated, conclusions documented, resources redirected. But the case was never closed in the way people imagine closure. It remains open in memory, in community, in the spaces where answers still feel incomplete. That openness is not a failure. It is an honest reflection of reality. The children are remembered not only for how they vanished, but for how they lived, however briefly. Their stories continue through the people who love them, through the changes their absence forced into the world. They are present in the questions asked more carefully now, in the pauses taken before assuming everything is fine. Their legacy is not resolution. It is awareness. There is something haunting about ordinary places after extraordinary loss. A streetlight flickering on at dusk. A backyard filled with voices. A party unfolding without incident. These moments carry a quiet reminder that the line between normal and catastrophic is thinner than anyone wants to believe. That reminder does not fade. It hums beneath the surface of everyday life. In telling this story, there is no attempt to offer comfort where none exists, only to honor the truth as it stands. 12 children disappeared. Decades passed. A terrifying understanding emerged. And still, the world kept moving. That tension between continuity and rupture is where the story lives now. What remains is not just a mystery, but a responsibility to remember, to resist the urge to simplify, to acknowledge that some losses do not resolve, they reshape, and to carry forward the names, the lives, the questions, not as relics of fear, but as reminders of what it means to pay attention in a world that often looks away. The night that should have been ordinary is gone, but its echo is still here, moving quietly through time, asking to be noticed. Long after the investigation receded from public view, long after reports were filed and conclusions carefully worded, the story continued to live in a place no agency could catalog. It lived in memory, in instinct, in the quiet decisions people made without always knowing why. This was not an ending shaped by resolution, but by awareness, a lingering presence that refused to be neatly contained. The truth that emerged was not cinematic in the way people expect from stories told years later. There was no single villain unmasked under bright lights. No final confrontation that restored order. Instead, there was recognition. A slow, sobering recognition that something had existed in the spaces people assumed were safe, and that it had thrived precisely because no one wanted to imagine it there. For many, this realization was more disturbing than any singular explanation could have been. It forced a confrontation with vulnerability, not just of children, but of systems, of assumptions, of trust itself. The idea that danger could move quietly, patiently, without leaving chaos in its wake, challenged the belief that harm always announces itself. It suggested that what people fear most is not always what they should be watching for. The families carried this knowledge in deeply personal ways. Some found that knowing the broader truth allowed them to reframe their grief. Their children had not been lost of randomness or neglect. They had been caught in something larger, something calculated. This understanding did not lessen the pain, but it replaced some of the helplessness with meaning. Others found the truth unbearable, a weight that pressed down harder than uncertainty ever had. For them, unanswered questions had once allowed space for imagination, for hope. Clarity closed those doors. There was no universal response, no correct way to absorb what had been uncovered. Grief does not obey logic. It moves differently through every life it touches. What united the families was not agreement, but endurance. They had survived decades of not knowing, of being forgotten by the world at large, of learning how to exist alongside absence. Whatever the truth was, they had already faced worse, the endless waiting. In the years that followed, the case became something people referenced without always realizing it. It influenced training manuals. It appeared in quiet discussions about data sharing and interagency cooperation. It informed how community events were structured, how supervision was considered, how assumptions were questioned. Rarely named directly, it nonetheless left its imprint for investigators who had worked the case. It became a point of reflection that followed them long after retirement. Many spoke of it as an investigation that changed how they thought, not just about crime, but about people. It taught them that harm does not require spectacle, that absence can be as meaningful as evidence, that patience can be weaponized just as effectively as force. Some carried guilt, wondering whether different instincts, different questions, different frameworks might have revealed the truth sooner. Others accepted that the tools simply had not existed yet. That perspective often comes too late to change the past. Most live somewhere between those extremes, holding regret and realism in uneasy balance. The children themselves remain what they had always been, irreplaceable. No explanation altered that. No revelation restored what was taken. But in being remembered fully, as individuals rather than case numbers, they regained something that disappearance had tried to erase. They were no longer only associated with fear. They were associated with love, with specificity, with lives that mattered deeply and still do. The world did not become safer overnight because of what was learned. Safety is not that simple. But the way people understood risk shifted subtly and unevenly. Parents became more attentive not just to strangers, but to environments. Institutions learned to question the absence of evidence rather than take comfort in it. Communities began to understand that vigilance is not suspicion, it is care. There's a temptation, when looking back on stories like this, to search for reassurance, to believe that uncovering the truth closes the door on repetition. The reality is more fragile. Awareness does not guarantee protection. It only creates the possibility of it. What people choose to do with that awareness determines whether it becomes meaningful. In quiet moments, the story returns. It surfaces in the pause before assuming a child is nearby, in the instinct to count heads more than once, in the understanding that trust should be shared, not assumed. These are not acts of fear. They are acts of memory. The night itself exists now only in fragments. A warm evening, music playing, laughter. No one present understood what was unfolding in real time. That ordinariness is what makes the story endure.